Hi, everybody. My name is Janneke Hille, and I'm a professor at University of Washington in Seattle. And today I'm very excited to be telling you about the research I've been conducting, myself and my lab have been conducting in the forests of Mount Rainier National Park. So hopefully we are all aware that our climate is changing. So in the graph on the left, what you see is both information on the amount that the globe has warmed in the last 100 years, which has been about 1.3 degrees Fahrenheit, as well as various projections of how much more the globe will warm in the next 100 or so years, which is anywhere between 2 or 3 all the way up to 6 degrees Fahrenheit. And of course, climate change has also occurred locally. So what you see here is for the Pacific Northwest is you see dots on the map here that represent the location of climate stations that occur in the Pacific Northwest. And the color of the dot tells you how much the temperatures have warmed at those climate stations, with reds representing increases in temperatures, and the size of the dot tells you by how much has warmed. And hopefully it's obvious to everybody that there are pretty much only red dots on the map, and in generally those dots are quite large. So one of the questions myself and my lab group have been really involved in trying to answer is, how will this warming affect the forests around us? And so, for example, if you consider Mount Rainier National Park, which has really dense coniferous forests at low elevations, and then at mid elevations you have montane forests where the trees start becoming a little more patchy and further apart, and you see a different suite of species, ranging all the way up to subalpine meadows at higher elevations. One question is how will this be influenced by climate change? Of course, one expectation we might have is that forests will simply shift upwards in elevation. So low elevation forests will shift into the range where montane forests occurred. Montane forests will shift where subalpine meadows used to be, and subalpine meadows will simply move up the mountain. And of course, the simple prediction relies on two assumptions. One is that climate really determines where plants and where forests are, so that when it gets warmer, that tree line will move upward. And the second assumption is that trees can keep up with climate change. And by this I mean that they can move their seeds fast enough and sort of have their population growth be rapid enough so that they can actually shift their distribution upwards in pace with climate change. So what I would like to do today is to tell you a little bit about the research that we've been doing to try to answer those two questions, with the first being, does climate actually determine the range limits of trees? So are the elevational distributions of different tree species at Mount Rainier National Park, are they determined by climate? And the second, can these different tree species keep up with climate change such that as it warms that they might shift their distributions upward as rapidly as climate is warming? But first, let me tell you a little bit about the study system. So I really consider Mount Rainier National Park as my laboratory for climate change research. Working in a mountain when you're interested in climate change is really convenient because there is a lot of climate in a very small amount of space. And also, if you're interested in species, the species have their range limits that occur at many different locations around the park. So some of the characteristics of these forests are depicted in the pictures here on the right. So first, the trees are just enormous. And I think for anybody that is not from the Pacific Northwest, I think this will be really obvious, but it's worth re-emphasizing. For example, the tree that a previous grad student of mine, Eileen Ettinger, is hugging is a Doug fir. It's probably about 2 meters in diameter. And a tree of that size, you could probably build 3 wooden houses, 3-bedroom wooden houses from a tree that big. So the trees are just enormous out here. Second is these trees can be really, really old, up to 400 or 500 years. And one way to think about this is that some of the trees, this tree that Eileen is hugging, was probably around when Columbus stumbled upon the New World in 1492. At the same time, it's been about 20 human generations since that time. And finally, the number of tree species in the Pacific Northwest in any one forest is actually fairly low. So despite the huge climate gradient that we have within the park, there's only 21 tree species in the entire park. If you went to a forest in the tropics, say in Panama or in Costa Rica, you would get about 1,000 different species in a hectare alone. So these forests are really cool, and they're also really unusual. And finally, of course, this is one of the snowiest places. So this picture here was taken in May of 2014, and you can see there's still quite a bit of snow on the ground. And this snow really drives a lot of the ecology of the system. So the tree species we've been working with are some of the most dominant and common tree species in the park. And if you've taken a hike around here, you have almost certainly seen all of these tree species. So at low elevations, we have species like western red cedar and Douglas fir and western hemlock. And then at high elevations, we have yellow cedar, Pacific silver fir, subalpine fir, and mountain hemlock. And these 7 species probably make up about 90% of the individual trees you're going to see around the park. So by studying just these 7 tree species, we really can understand quite a lot about the ecology of the forests out here. Okay, so that's a little bit of the study system. So now I'm going to tell you how we've gone about trying to understand whether climate determines where tree species are. So when I say, does climate determine where tree species are, this is kind of what I mean. So for example, if we were to walk up the mountain and keep an eye out for one particular tree species, let's say Pacific silver fir, at low elevations, Pacific silver fir doesn't really occur. It's kind of a mid-elevation species. As we start hiking up the mountain, we see more and more individuals of Pacific silver fir, but at some point it starts petering out and we no longer see individuals of that species. So we might be interested in knowing if climate determines the range limits of that species, and what that would imply is that for the individuals that are occurring at the very highest elevations, what that means is one of the reasons that that population isn't expanding further upward is it's simply too cold. In other words, if we were to plot out the relationship, for example, between temperature and growth, yearly variation in growth, we might expect to see an increase in performance when climate warms. So we'd expect to see a positive relationship between temperature and a performance metric, like say, for example, growth. By the same token, if climate is preventing that Pacific silver fir from occurring at lower elevations, then for the individuals that occur at the very lowest elevations, what we'd expect to see is a negative relationship between temperature and performance. So if we jack up the temperature in warm years, we would expect to see lower growth if it is that climate is determining the range limits of those species. So fortunately, we can actually address this question by taking advantage of the biology of tree growth. So trees are a very inconvenient study system in many ways because they are difficult to work with experimentally. But they do have one huge advantage in that they lay down a growth ring every year, and the width of that ring tells us how well the tree grew. So what we can do is we can collect information about tree growth at the upper and lower range limits of the species, and then we can compare it to the annual climate, so variation in temperature, for example, at or close to these locations. And we're very fortunate that Mount Rainier National Park has a long-term climate station, so we know what the temperatures were, whether, what years were particularly warm years and what years were particularly cool years, going back all the way to the 1920s. So let's start with a question: does climate constrain range limits? We would expect to see a positive relationship between temperature and growth if that were the case. And I hope that you're convinced by the graph on the right that when we look at the relationship between mean annual temperature and growth of mountain hemlock in any given year, that yes, we actually do see that positive relationship. So each of these dots represents growth in 1 year for 20 different mountain hemlock individuals occurring at the upper elevational range limit. And on the y-axis is growth. And I hope you're convinced that there's a positive relationship there, which is exactly the relationship we'd expect to see if temperature, if climate was constraining the upper range limit of that species. Now things get a little more complicated when we look at the lower range limit. So when we look at individual trees that are growing at the lowest elevation that the species occurs with. Here, when we look at the relationship between temperature and the growth of those individual trees, we see no relationship at all. Now, if temperature was playing a role at constraining the growth of that species at the lower range limit in a way that suggests that temperature is constraining that lower range limit, we'd expect to see a negative relationship. But instead, we see no relationship at all. And in fact, what we can do is we can look at the relationship between growth and climate, both temperature and snow, for all the different species. And what I'm going to show you in a second is a table that summarizes the results for all the different tree species we looked at. So here, each of these rows is a different one of the 7 tree species. And what you see is arrows representing whether warmer temperatures had positive or negative effects on growth, and whether that differed between the upper and lower range limits, and that's represented by the red arrow. The blue arrows represent the effects of snow, whether more snow has positive or negative effects on growth at the upper and the lower range limit of the tree species. Now, the first row shows you what the predicted effects of climate would be if climate was was constraining growth in such a way that, in the way that we predict it would if climate was constraining range limits. So hopefully from this you can see that climate does appear to constrain growth at upper range limits, but really only for the upper elevation tree species. So both at the lower range limits of those species as well as for the lower elevation species, climate does not appear to be playing much of a role. All right, so that leaves us with the question: if climate isn't constraining all range limits of these species, then what is going on? Well, of course, trees do more than just grow every year. For example, their seedlings recruit and the tall trees die. And it could be that climatic constraints at other life history stages are what's determining the range limits of those species. At the same time, we also know that the environments in which these tree species occur in are very different at high elevations versus low elevations. It's easy to imagine that at high elevations, for example, around paradise, that climate really does negatively impact all parts of the tree species' performance, their growth, their reproduction, and their mortality. But when you look at what the forests look like at low elevations, it's really much denser, temperatures, snow, there's not as much snow around, and climate's probably not as harsh. It could be that other factors like competitive interactions or interactions with herbivores or with pathogens are playing more of a role at these lower elevations. Okay, so hopefully I've convinced you that climate does constrain tree growth at tree line and is probably playing a very important role at determining the range limits of those upper elevation, those species at upper elevations, but that there's some other more complex effects going on at other life history stages or perhaps via interactions with species. So now I want to move on to ask, can trees keep up with climate change? Because it seems likely that climate is playing at least a role at the upper elevations in terms of the range limits, and maybe indirectly via interactions, but we still need to know whether trees could actually shift their ranges fast enough to keep up with climate change. So one way to think about that, what does it actually mean for a tree species to keep up, is to think about what happens when climate changes. So let's imagine a gradient of temperature going from hot to cold. So this could be coming from California, moving all the way up to Alaska, or going from the low elevation of a mountain all the way to a high elevation, for example, driving from the Nisqually entrance all the way to Paradise. And now imagine that there's a tree species that has kind of a range of climate in which it's comfortable in. And now imagine that climate changes. What's going to happen is that suitable climate is going to shift. It's going to move uphill or it's going to move north in latitude. And what it means for a particular tree species to keep up with climate change is that the populations have to grow at the leading edge of the range. So the trees have to send out seeds. Those seeds have to turn into seedlings and grow up into adult trees to shift with a suitable climate. And at the other side, at the contracting side of the range edge, populations have to disappear because individual trees die. So what we can ask is whether the rates at which these tree populations produce seeds and produce seedlings and grow up, and the rate at which the trees die, seem to be fast enough for these trees to keep. Now, at first glance, of course, this seems like an incredibly tall order because these trees are enormous. And, if you take, for example, this Western red cedar, the very earliest stages, this tiny, tiny little seedling that weighs less than 1,000th of a gram, seems like it would take a really long time to get to the adult stage, as pictured on the right, which is quite a bit larger. But of course, we have to examine the data before we really know for sure. So what did we do to address this question? The first thing we've been doing for the last number of years is basically just asking how many seedlings of the different species that we monitor are actually occurring beyond or near the upper range limit. Like, are these tree species actually sending out enough seeds that there's propagules and seedlings ready to take advantage of what happens when climate warms? So we've done this for many years. And here are the results for 4 of our focal species. So what you see here is a bar graph representing the number of seedlings per meter square within the core of the species range, so where it's very abundant, and at the edge or beyond the upper range limit, so that's in the light green. And hopefully what you can see here is that with the exception of Western hemlock, the density of seedlings at the edge or beyond the range is really much, much lower than it is within the core of the range. And if you look at the actual values of the y-axis, you'll also see that those numbers are actually not very big. So for example, for Alaska cedar, there's a really low density of seedlings at the upper range limits. So we can say that seedling recruitment is really low at the upper range edges, which would tend to slow the rates at which these tree species can shift their ranges with climate change. We can also ask, okay, so these seedlings will eventually get established, but how long does it take them to become reproductive at the upper range limits? Those seedlings have to grow up and produce more seeds to move that population forward in order for them to keep up with climate change. So what we can do is we can ask, how long does it take those little bitty seedlings to get to be about 2 meters tall, which is approximately the smallest tree that I've ever seen at these high elevations with cones on it. So what we did is we harvested, this was all permitted by the MPS, we harvested a number of saplings, and then we sanded them down and we counted the rings so that we knew both how tall the sapling was and we knew how old it was, from which we could get an estimate of the growth rates, the height growth rates. Here, for example, is a cross-section of one of our trees, and you can hopefully already tell that the growth rate is not very high because this particular sapling was about 1¼ meters tall, which is a little shorter than myself. I'm about 5'4", and it was 110 years. So it took it 110 years to get to be 1.25 meters tall. And indeed, when we look at the average amount of time it takes 3 different tree species to get to be 2 meters tall, you can see it ranges anywhere from 80 to 120 years. So in other words, there's very slow growth, and this would tend to also slow down the rate at which these tree species can shift their ranges with climate change. Finally, we can ask, So that those two processes are both occurring at the leading edge of the range, like as these trees are potentially colonizing new habitat. We can also ask how fast might the lower or the southern range edge contract? And that's really a question about how long will it take trees to die at lower range limits. And again, we're fortunate to have access to a really great data set collected from long-term tree plots that was first set up by Jerry Franklin and has been censused for a long time by the Permanent Sample Plot volunteer crew. We have about greater than 10,000 trees that are tagged, and survival has been monitored for over 35 years. So that can give us information on how fast trees die at lower range limits. And what we can see is that the annual survival rate of these six of our different focal species is quite high. So in other words, all of these tree species have less than a 2% chance of dying in any given year. And just to put that in context, what that means is that you had a population of trees, of 40 trees, it would take over 35 years for half of those to disappear at that annual survival rate. So in other words, what that means is that existing populations will be very slow to disappear. All right, so what does this mean? What this is telling me is that even with climate changing as rapidly as it is predicted to in the next 100 years, I'm really not very optimistic about how fast these trees will be able to shift their ranges, although that could change in the future, and I'll talk about that in a second. So this might lead you to think about what does the future hold for the forests at Mount Rainier National Park. So at low elevations, I really think we're not going to see very fast change for now. So these trees grow very slowly, they die very slowly, and we just don't expect to see a lot of turnover for now. Now, whether this is resilience or just a delayed sensitivity to changing climates, I think is an open question. At high elevations, where climate is really playing a very strong role in constraining the growth rates of those upper elevation trees, I do think we're going to see more rapid change, because we're basically going to see a biome shift from wildflowers to trees. And so we're likely to see more rapid change. And indeed, we've already seen a lot of the meadows at Mount Rainier fill with trees over the last century or so. Now, of course, what we don't know, what's a big unknown, is how climate change might influence fire frequencies, likely to increase it, but not clear if it's going to do so in the western part of the state. It might also, climate change might also influence pests and pathogens, which might also really cause our forests to turn over very fast. So when I say that we think we'll see slow change for now, but we don't really know if that will continue in the future, that's largely because a lot of us are just not really sure what climate change is going to do to some of these other factors. All right, with that, I'd like to thank all the different grad students and field assistants, really lots of them over the years that have contributed to the research in this lab, also my funding sources. And I'd be more than happy to answer any questions that you might have. I'm not sure if I'm going to be present virtually, but you can feel free to send any questions to this email address if you have them. Thank you for your attention.